Hi everyone, and welcome to The Sleepy Scientist. I'm really happy you're here. Tonight, we're going to go on a calm and quiet trip to learn something amazing. So get comfy, take a deep breath, and let's enjoy this peaceful science story together. Before we start, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? If you like relaxing science videos, don't forget to tap the like button. Now let's begin. Long before the words we now speak ever found shape on the wind, long before the map of the world bore the footprints of our kind, there were others. They walked on two legs, breathed the same air, touched the soil with wondering hands, and watched the stars wheel overhead. Their bones are scattered now, buried deep beneath ancient rivers and caves, but their presence lingers like shadows cast at dusk, quiet, nearly forgotten, yet undeniably there. These were the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and those whose names we may never know, whose existence is only hinted at by a fragment of jaw, a whisper of DNA, or the curve of a stone tool. They were not us, and yet not entirely other. In their bones lie stories that still breathe, a tale of firelight and cold winds, of tender gestures, of struggle and persistence beneath a sky that watched them come and go. If you sit very still and close your eyes, you can almost hear their footsteps echoing on frostbitten ground. Feel the pulse of life as it stirred in those early beings who lived without the clutter of history, but not without the depth of meaning. It is easy to think of ourselves as the centre of time, the final verse in a long poem, but in truth, we're a chapter still being written. Before us came the Neanderthals, who were not brutes but thinkers, artisans and caretakers. In the cold caves of Europe they knapped flint into blades, buried their dead with flowers, and possibly painted dreams onto stone walls. Their skulls were broad, their brows strong, their bodies built to endure the harshest winters, and yet inside their minds flickered the light of emotion, of connection. They lived in small bands, shared food, protected the vulnerable. Fossils show bones healed by the care of others, elderly carried despite their frailty, and children mourned. In their silent ways they knew family, felt warmth, and perhaps even love. One can imagine a Neanderthal mother humming a soft wordless tune as she cradled her child, the crackle of fire dancing between them and stars whispering overhead. Their story is not of violence, but of quiet resilience. Farther east in the misty ranges of Siberia and the sunlit plateaus of Southeast Asia lived the Denisovans. For a long time they were invisible, known only from a fragment of a pinky bone and a sliver of tooth. But from that whisper, a world bloomed. Their genes live on in the people of Melanesia and parts of Asia, stitched into the tapestry of human ancestry like threads of forgotten song. We don't know how they looked, or what words they might have used if any, but we know they adapted to high altitudes, that their blood carried wisdom suited for thin air and cold stone. Somewhere, in some cave now collapsed, they made tools with precision, perhaps wove fibres, maybe sang songs the wind has since swallowed. They are not gone, not entirely. Their legacy moves in the lungs of a Sherpa, in the eyes of a child with inherited resilience. It is as though the earth itself remembers, gently folding them into the breath of the present. But even these named ancestors are only part of the deeper hush. There were others, the mysterious ones, the Red Deer cave people of China, who may have lingered far longer than expected, bearing features both ancient and new. The hobbit-like Homo floresiensis of Indonesia, barely more than 3 feet tall, who lived among giant rats and birds on an island of forgotten time, and deeper still, the elusive Homo naledi, whose bones were discovered deep in the dark chambers of a South African cave, placed there intentionally, perhaps ritually, by hands that sought meaning in death. They too had curved fingers, small brains, but walked upright. Their story is strange. How could such a primitive mind make such thoughtful choices? It reminds us that intelligence is not a ladder, but a branching tree, with wisdom blooming in many forms. Imagine now a world filled not with one kind of human, but many. A world where Neanderthals roamed snow-cloaked valleys, while Denisovans climbed icy passes, and tiny people carved lives into the emerald shadows of tropical islands. Each had their way of being, their rhythm with the land. They lived close to nature, attuned to its murmurs, its hunger, its gifts. They watched the moon, learned when to gather roots and when to hunt, followed the migrations of beasts and the blossoming of trees. Life was not easy, but it was deeply felt. Every breath was a prayer, every footstep a memory left in mud and stone. In this world, the boundaries between human and other blurred, because to be human was not one thing. It was a spectrum, a harmony of shapes and minds and dreams. And then slowly they began to vanish. Not in a single moment, not in a thunderous war of dominance, but like mist retreating with the dawn. Some disappeared through climate, their food sources shifting or disappearing. Some may have merged with us, their songs blending into ours, their features softened into future generations. Others perhaps dwindled quietly, unremembered, leaving behind only stone and silence. Yet in that silence is not absence but echo. Because when we look into their bones, when we read their DNA, we are reading the pages of our own beginning. We are not separate from them. We are their continuation. There's a peculiar beauty in knowing that the ground beneath us once held other lives so like ours, that in the places where we now build cities or plant fields, once stood a figure of flesh and breath, watching the stars, wondering about the world. The next time you stand in a forest and feel something ancient watching, or gaze into a cave and feel the hush of time press against your chest, remember, these were their homes first. Their fires once flickered, where now we walk with phones and shoes and names. Their children laughed, their elders taught, their world, though quieter, was not less full. In every stone tool, in every fossilized bone, in every tiny fleck of inherited memory, they are still here, walking with us. So let the wind carry you back to that time. Let your mind drift across snowy steppes and moonlit jungles. Picture a Neanderthal father carving antler into a comb, a Denisovan child sleeping beneath fur, a hobbit-sad hunter weaving irons into traps. They were not myths, they were real, and they mattered. We are their legacy, their last verse, their living breath. And even though they are gone, they did not vanish without leaving a trace of themselves in the marrow of the earth, in the silence between our words, and in the spaces where wonder still lives. Drift now a little deeper into the stillness that lingers beneath history, where science gently meets wonder and the past hums like a buried heartbeat. If we close our eyes, we might begin to feel the quiet architecture of evolution shaping lives across eons. The Neanderthals did not simply live, they endured. They adapted to a world colder, darker, and wilder than the one we now know. Their tools, once mistaken for crude, are found to be refined, shaped not only for survival but with an unspoken grace, a functional artistry. They crafted spears for hunting, scraped hides into clothes, carved lines into antlers whose meaning we may never decipher. Each mark was a whisper, each edge a memory. Their lives were not measured by years, but by seasons survived, by the warmth of fire shared, and the rhythm of life in harsh terrain. We know now they controlled fire, that sacred flicker that softened food, warmed the air, and lit their faces with gold in the endless winter nights. The hearth may have been the first storyteller, crackling softly as elders spoke with gestures and gazes rather than speech. The Neanderthal's language, if it existed, may have flowed like wind, brief, simple, rich, with emotion rather than complexity. Their brains, nearly as large as ours and differently shaped, hint at minds that saw the world with both similarity and subtle strangeness. They could plan, they could mourn, they could sense the passing of time not with clocks, but with the changing colour of the sky, the migration of animals, the scent of rain. In burial sites we find pollen, placed where no flowers grew, suggesting they brought blooms to their dead. This act, so tender and silent, is the poetry of a mind that knew something of goodbye. Perhaps they believed the spirit lingered like mist, or that life cycled back into stone and sky. Perhaps they simply wanted to hold on. Whatever the reason, that one simple gesture, a flower placed on a resting friend, bridges a chasm of time and tells us they felt something. They were not animals, they were something else, close, shadowed, ancient cousins whose hearts beat once in caves that still echo with their presence. Meanwhile, the Denisovans, wrapped in greater mystery, leave fewer clues, but their impact runs through us like an invisible stream. They adapted to high-altitude life, their bodies equipped to survive where oxygen thins. Genetic traces suggest they had knowledge of terrain we can scarcely imagine. Snowy ridges, deep forests, limestone caves lit only by memory and fire. They too made tools, likely hunted in coordinated groups, lived in communities that shared resources and responsibilities. The tiny slivers of their DNA now whisper through the genes of millions, invisible threads that once bound muscle and mind to the cold peaks of Tibet, to the humid breath of ancient Indonesia. They may have looked like us or not. We may never truly know their faces, but we carry echoes of their survival, of their choices, in the vessels of our blood and breath. And then there is the incredible variety that once existed, a living mosaic of forms, abilities and insights. Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits, who lived on the island of Flores, carved out a world so different, so miniature, it feels like folklore. But they were real. Their skulls were small, their stature childlike, and yet their tools reveal precision. Their survival on an isolated island points to adaptability, to learning, to a unique form of intelligence sculpted by scarcity and environment. The fact that such a species could exist alongside elephants smaller than ponies and birds taller than humans paints a world we might call mythical, yet it was factual. Real stones, real fires, real lives. And then there's Homo luzonensis, found in the Philippines. Another surprise, another version of human, unknown to us until recently, stepping from the past with curled toes and bones too delicate to endure time easily, yet there, defiantly in the soil of ancient caves. They add new verses to the poem of human existence, verses we did not know were missing. Homo naledi, perhaps the most haunting, forces us to reconsider what makes a mind human. Deep in the Rising Star cave system, their bones were discovered in chambers so hard to reach that even modern cavers struggled. And yet, they brought their dead there. Not by accident, not by flood or fate, but by deliberate movement. They placed their dead in the dark. Perhaps it was a sacred place. Perhaps it was a sanctuary of memory. With brains smaller than ours by far, they still chose to care for the dead. They lit no torch we can find, left no writing, spoke no known words, but they told a story in action. And that story, in its quiet strangeness, brings us closer to understanding that intelligence is not only in the size of the brain, but in the size of the heart, in the choices we make when no one is watching, in the rituals we perform when we know the end has come. There's something deeply humbling in realizing we are the only ones left. Once, there were many ways to be human, many paths carved through forests and savannas. Now, only one remains, ours, but we are not superior. We are the lucky line, the branch that survived the long winds of time and change. Others were strong, others were wise, but fate, mutation, and circumstance gave us the torch. We carry it not because we won, but because we remained, and perhaps because we inherited enough of them to carry their memory forward in stories, in science, in sleep. The world they lived in was wilder than ours, more primal and full of immediate truths. Hunger, shelter, heat, connection. In some ways they may have felt more deeply, more fully, because every breath was earned, every moment fragile. As we explore these ancient beings, we are not just learning about the past, we are remembering it. The ground beneath our feet once held their steps. The air we breathe is stirred by the same winds that carried their scent. Their bones, cracked by time and weight, hold not only calcium and marrow, but memory. Science brushes away the soil, but it is imagination that gives them breath again. In classrooms and labs, we name and measure. But in stillness, in stories, we feel them. We honour them not by claiming superiority, but by understanding their lives as precious, strange and beautiful. So let the cave walls stand as galleries. Let the stone tools be read like books. Let the pollen in ancient graves be bouquets of meaning. These were the pre-human inhabitants of Earth. Not monsters, not lesser things, but companions on the long road of becoming. And though their voices have stilled, their echoes shape our bones, our minds, our very sense of who we are. In them we find not strangers, but kin. We are not separate from the past. We are its breath made visible. The more we look back, the more we realize we never walked alone. Now let us drift toward the quiet conclusion of this ancient path, where science and wonder settle gently into reflection, like dust on the bones of time. If we listen closely, beyond the hum of cities and the digital noise of our present, we might hear it, the soft, almost inaudible rhythm of those who came before. Not ancestors in the direct sense, but neighbours from an older world, whose stories were nearly lost, buried beneath sediment and silence. And yet, here they are, emerging again through the careful hands of archaeologists, through DNA unwound like thread from a spool of forgotten cloth. The story of the pre-human inhabitants of Earth is not one of conquest or disappearance alone. It is a story of interweaving, of shadowed kinship, of shared dawns and overlapping twilights. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo naledi, Floresiensis, and the many unnamed souls who once breathed our air shaped their lives from nature's quiet instructions and left behind a legacy we are only beginning to understand. What does it mean that we carry their genes? That their resilience, their adaptations, their strengths now move through our blood like ancient rivers? In Tibet, Denisovan DNA allows modern humans to thrive where oxygen is scarce, a gift left behind by those mountain dwellers we never met. In Europe, up to 2% of many people's genomes carry Neanderthal signatures, traces of unions between species once thought incompatible, but now understood as natural, complex, and deeply human. These were not rare accidents, but moments of connection. In those prehistoric unions, something new was born, not just biologically, but symbolically. The line between us and them blurred, and from that blur, a new chapter of humanity emerged, one that bore the strengths of both and walked farther than either might have done alone. We are not the end of a story, we are the continuation of many, and yet even as we inherit their traits, we also inherit their sins. They did not write, they did not leave behind books or monuments. What they left is subtler. A tool worn smooth by use, a tooth with grooves of grit, a bone carefully buried, a wall stained with ochre. From these we must read their intentions, their dreams, their fears. It's a soft science, this reading of lives long gone. It requires not only precision but humility, because the truth is, we may never know them fully, and that's all right. Some things are not meant to be solved like equations, but held like questions. In this way, they become more than curiosities, they become mirrors. When we ask who they were, we are also asking who we are, what makes us human, and how much of that humanity was already alive before we named it. Consider how they faced the world, not with armies or alphabets, but with bare hands, keen eyes, and a deep intimacy with the land. They knew how to listen. They knew the language of birds, the cycle of roots, the movement of shadow across stone. They understood the moon not as myth, but as a measure. They survived not through domination, but through balance. They made no walls. They needed none. Theirs was a world of openness, where every sound mattered, every breeze carried meaning. In a way, they lived closer to the heart of the earth than we do now. They were not perfect, but they were present. And presence in a world of distraction feels almost sacred. The tragedy, if there is one, is not in their disappearance, but in how long we failed to see them clearly. For decades, Neanderthals were caricatured as dim and brutal, a foil to our clever eyes. But now, as the soil yields its secrets, we see a different picture, one of complexity, emotion, and quiet brilliance. The same is true for the others. Homo naledi, with their small brains, did things we associate with ritual and memory. Homo floresiensis thrived in isolation, a feat of adaptability. The more we learn, the more we must loosen our grip on the ladder of progress and embrace the idea of a branching tree. Each species a leaf, each story a part of the whole. So where does that leave us, the only human species left? It leaves us with responsibility to remember, to wonder, to carry their stories forward, not as dusty footnotes, but as living threads in our own tapestry. When we light a fire, when we sit in silence, when we hold the hand of a child or care for the old, we echo them. We become the continuation of a million silent acts of tenderness, survival, and adaptation. We give voice to those who never had one, and in doing so we become more fully human, not by separating ourselves from the past, but by welcoming it in. Let this story then be a kind of gentle offering, not a tale of dominance but of connection, not a warning but a whisper, a reminder that the earth was once home to many kinds of humans, each unique, each precious. And though the winds of time have scattered their bones and muted their names, the essence of who they were remains, ditched into our genes, echoed in our gestures, mirrored in our capacity for empathy, for reflection, for curiosity. We are not alone in the long arc of history, we never were. In every step we take, we walk beside ghosts who were never truly gone, only waiting to be remembered with gentleness. So tonight, if you find yourself gazing at the stars, consider this. Perhaps a Neanderthal once stood beneath that same sky, holding a child, watching the constellations and feeling the same awe you feel now. Perhaps a Denisovan sat by a river, fingers dipped in the current, wondering what lay beyond the mountains. Perhaps a hobbit-like woman in a jungle clearing listened to the cries of a bird and knew it meant the rains would come. They lived not in myth, but in realness, and through us, their wonder lives on. Close your eyes now and let their memory settle softly in your breath. The earth remembers them, and now so do you. Long before the invention of speech, before the hum of syllables flowed from tongue to air, there were beings who walked upright beneath the open sky, silent, alert, curious. They did not name the wind, yet they felt it. They did not call the sun, yet they followed its rising and resting with reverence. These were the early hominins, the ones who came before language, for civilization, for even the soft murmurs of memory as we know it. They lived not in cities, not even in villages, but in scattered bands, following herds and seasons, shaping the land with their footprints rather than their voices. In them, the mind was blooming like a spring that had not yet broken through the soil, but was stirring, trembling, preparing. Their world was immediate and sensory, a life of sights, smells, textures and sounds, each etched with meaning long before words carved it into thought. These beings, Australopithecus afarensis, Homo habilis and Homo erectus, lived across millennia with no maps, no written records, no memory preserved beyond the stories written in the shape of their bones. And yet they thrived. In the hot grasslands of Africa, they stood on two legs and looked outward. This single act, standing upright, changed everything. It freed their hands, expanded their vision, and perhaps, somewhere deep in the brain, sparked a sense of self. With each step, their brains grew more intricate, their fingers more precise, their lives more intertwined with survival and curiosity. Imagine a morning on the savannah, the tall grass whispering against brown legs, a cool breeze sweeping in as the sun lifts over acacia trees. A child watches a group of insects crawl across a rock, fascinated. A mother teaches her daughter to find roots beneath the dry soil. No words pass between them, only gestures touch the rhythm of action and attention. The early walkers knew fire, though perhaps not how to create it. They gathered the embers of lightning-struck trees and guarded it like a treasure. Fire warmed them, protected them, made meat soft and belly full. Around it, their groups likely sat in silence, faces flickering with golden shadow, the air thick with the scent of smoke and closeness. Perhaps they did not yet tell stories as we understand them, but stories lived in their eyes, in the scar of a healed wound, in the way they chose to return to the same tree, the same river. Their memories were not bound in language but carried in repetition, in movement, in ritual gestures passed from hand to hand. Each child learned by watching, by mimicking, by being held and shown. There was no need to speak because life was immediate, its meaning direct, like the pressure of a warm hand or the taste of ripe fruit. With Homo habilis, meaning handyman, the hands began to carve intention into stone. The first tools were simple but not crude. Flakes of rock chipped with care, used to break bones for marrow, to shape wood, to dig, to survive. These tools were not made in haste. They required planning, understanding, a sense of cause and effect. To hold a rock and strike it against another with just the right angle, to predict how it would split, this was the birth of something profound. Though their throats were not yet shaped for complex sound, their minds were shaping the world. And in this shaping, thought was born, not yet language, but something close, a rhythm of idea, of purpose moving from mind to hand to object. In the time of Homo erectus, the world expanded. They left Africa, spread into Asia, into Europe, following prey, following seasons. They lit fires more deliberately, shaped better tools, and possibly built the first shelters. Their legs were long, their strides sure, their eyes fixed on horizons no hominin had yet seen. They learned to adapt, to make fire a constant companion, to keep the flame alive even as the world changed around them. In them, we see not only survival but foresight. They carried stones from place to place, anticipating need. They stayed near water, understood migration patterns, made decisions not just for the moment, but for tomorrow. Thought was growing more complex, more layered. Though still silent in voice, their choices spoke volumes. And then, somewhere in those thousands of years, the earliest hints of symbolic thought began to stir. A tool shaped not just for function, but with symmetry. A shell marked with a line, a piece of red ochre kept perhaps for beauty, perhaps for something more. These were small things, easy to overlook, but they mark the beginning of mind expanding beyond the now. To see beauty, to preserve a shape, to mark a moment, these are the seeds of what would one day become language. A sentence does not begin with a word. It begins with a feeling that longs to be shared, and that longing was alive even in those who had never spoken. These beings lived close to the earth. They knew the sound of approaching rain, the call of birds before a hunt, the smell of danger in the wind. Their ears were sharper than ours, their noses more attuned. In many ways, their silence was not lack but clarity. They listened more than we do. They watched more deeply. Without words to distract, their minds moved like the breeze, steady, alert, open. In that space, perhaps they felt a kind of peace we no longer know. Their lives were hard, yes, but not cluttered. Hunger, cold, fear, all were real, but so was simplicity, presence, the sacred rhythm of day and night. To wake, to find food, to walk, to rest. This was enough, this was life. As we sift through fossils and flint, we are not only studying them, we are reaching for something we lost. For the quiet before language, for the state of being fully present in the body, in the world, without naming everything into distance. When the early hominins looked at the sky, they did not call it blue or vast or divine. They simply looked, and in that looking was wonder. We have wrapped the world in names and meaning. They met it as it was, raw, unfiltered, holy in its silence. Now imagine the passing of a life in that time. There may have been no funeral, no eulogy, but perhaps there was still pause. Perhaps the group lingered near the body for a while. Perhaps someone placed a hand on still skin. Perhaps in their silences they felt the weight of absence. Emotion does not require words. Grief does not ask for grammar. And love, that oldest of all human things, may have flickered in their hearts as surely as it does in ours. Even before we spoke we felt. Even before we named we knew. They walked before language but not before meaning. They lived before speech but not before story. Their lives were the stories, etched in bone, in stone, in the long curve of time that bends from them to us. We are not the beginning of humanity. We are its most recent echo. And when we listen closely, when we strip away the noise and return to breath, to earth, to silence, we can still hear them. Not in words, but in the rhythm of our own bodies, in the shape of our hands, in the oldest corners of our minds. They are not lost. They are still walking deep within us, reminding us of a time when the world was seen without names and lived without walls. Let us now move further into this gentle path of silence, into the time when thought first began to weave its threads beneath the skin of instinct. The ones who walked before language lived in worlds that spoke in scent and light, in the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the shimmer of a waterline at dawn. They did not need nouns to name a tree, for the tree was already known, by the feel of its bark, the coolness of its shadow, the fruit it gave, or the danger it held. Life was not separate from meaning. It was meaning, unfolding with every step, every sound, every shift in the sky. In this slow and sensory existence, the early hominins lived fully awake to the world around them, their days marked not by hours but by movement, hunger, heat, and shelter. If you close your eyes, you might feel it, the raw, unmediated clarity of a life without language, where the body was the map and the world its script. Among them, Homo erectus began to spread further, to carry their knowing across continents. They shaped tools with more intention, hunted in more coordinated groups, and tended fire not as a mystery but as a companion. They returned to the same sites again and again, suggesting memory, a sense of home, or at least familiarity. They likely learned from one another in silence, by watching, mimicking, refining. A child would crouch beside an elder and learn how to flake a stone, not through instruction but through patient presence. The process itself was the teacher. Over years, these practices deepened, became shared rituals. Though they had no shared word for teaching, they passed down survival through motion and rhythm. The birth of culture, even in its simplest form, does not require speech. It only requires repetition, memory, and a longing to connect. The body became the first language, a gesture to follow, a posture of warning, a touch of comfort. In every flex of fingers or narrowing of eyes, information was passed. Before mouths carried meaning, eyes did. Expressions like the furrow of a brow or the curl of a lip became signs. Emotions ran across their faces just as they do across ours now. Fear, pleasure, sadness, curiosity. These feelings did not need vocabulary to be shared. They existed first as primal as breath, and in that shared recognition of expression, the roots of empathy were sown. Empathy does not wait for verbs. It blooms in the way one reaches out when another stumbles, in how one lingers when another lies still. Among these early beings, empathy may have been one of the first bridges between minds, and in time something else emerged, memory that reached beyond the moment. Not only the memory of where water could be found or where fruit ripened in a certain season, but memory held in the hands. Tools began to change. Acheulean hand axes, symmetrical and carefully shaped, appeared and persisted for over 1 million years. The consistency across regions suggests that ideas were not only formed, they were passed on. One individual learned how to strike flint in a particular way, and that shape, that idea, was carried through generations. This was knowledge without words, travelling farther than we could have imagined. A tool became a message from one mind to another, across time and space. The axe was not just stone, it was memory made visible. Fire too became not just warmth, but focus. It drew people together, extended the hours of the day, offered time for reflection or perhaps even imagination. Around fire, stories might have begun to stir, not in speech, but in glances, in shared memory, in mimicry and mime. A gesture might recall a hunt, a movement might suggest a dream. In those early nights, storytelling began not with sentences, but with movement and light. Shadows on stone, the play of hands in the flickering glow, laughter or silence shared in unison. These were the seeds of narrative. And perhaps, deep within the watching minds, the first questions began to form. What lies beyond the hill? Why does the storm come after the heat? Breath go when it leaves the body. These questions may not have had words, but they had weight. They hung in the air like the scent of rain, waiting to be shaped. Over time, the brain evolved not only in size but in connectivity. New pathways formed between regions that governed memory, emotion, movement, and sound. Slowly, the capacity for vocalization grew. The larynx shifted. The tongue became more agile. But before true language arrived, there were likely proto-words, calls, cries, syllables full of tone and rhythm. A low hum might have meant stay close. A click might have meant danger. Inflection gave layers of meaning, and the mind, shaped by years of silent awareness, was ready to assign significance to sound. Language did not erupt like a volcano. It dawned like morning, gradual, glowing, inevitable. Even before language, though, the world was already being organized in the mind. Early hominins likely grouped experiences, remembered patterns, linked cause and effect. They understood that after the rains came mushrooms, that certain trees bore sweeter fruit, that certain animals only passed through during specific moons. They were not naming these things yet, but they were knowing them. The mind was beginning to map the world not just as it was, but as it could be. Imagination, that uniquely human gift, was emerging. To imagine is to hold in the mind what is not yet present. That requires the mind to stretch, to create inner worlds. And that power, quiet, formless, unnamed, was beginning to pulse in their thoughts like the earliest song. We often define humanity by what we speak, by what we build, by what we write. But these early beings remind us that humanity is also what we feel, what we notice, what we remember. They lived fully without distraction. Their attention was full, their senses sharp. They did not daydream about distant futures or mourn imaginary past. They lived within the breath of now, and yet they carried memories, they dreamed in movement, and they cared for one another. All without the scaffold of language. This is not lesser, it is different. A purer form of presence, a quieter kind of understanding. In the final stretch of their long wordless journey, something began to shift, not all at once, but like leaves turning before a season fully arrives. The Homo heidelbergensis emerged, bridging the ancient and the almost modern, and in them we see signs of deeper planning, more complex social bonds, perhaps the faint outline of spoken words. Their tools grew in variety. They hunted larger prey together, coordinated over long distances. They may have marked objects, may have decorated, may have begun to sing, soft tones carried through caves as a way to calm children, or to comfort each other in darkness. The lines between silence and speech blurred, and somewhere in this long transition, language was born, not with a word, but with a sound that meant something shared, something understood. The world had never needed names before, but now, with the firelight flickering and eyes reflecting stars, something in the human soul reached out and gave the wind a sound, the mother a syllable, the fire a call. Even so, the silence was not forgotten. Even with the rise of language, the older knowing remained. To this day, babies first learn by touch, by gaze, by mimicry. Long before they speak, they understand and are understood. We carry within us the ancient pathways of pre-verbal thought, the ability to read eyes, feel gestures, interpret posture and breath. These are the gifts from our silent ancestors. In crowded rooms, we still understand someone's emotion without a word. In love, we often fall quiet, content with the presence of the other. In grief, words fail us, and we return to the oldest language of all, a hand held, a tear shared, a quiet gaze. These moments are not lesser for their silence. They are perhaps the most sacred. For in silence we feel the pulse of all those who came before us, who loved and lost and dreamed without ever speaking. And yet with language came a kind of magic, the ability to describe, to ask, to remember beyond memory. Once words took root, stories blossomed. The world was named, mapped, shaped into tales and teachings. Time was captured. Wisdom could be passed not just from one to another in the moment, but across lifetimes. But let us not forget that leap into language was only possible because of the long, silent foundation laid before. The minds of the silent walkers were ready. They had trained themselves in attention, in observation, in memory. Their silence was not an absence of thought. It was the soil in which thought deepened. Language was not a beginning, but a flowering nourished by the roots of their patient minds. So what remained of them now? More than fossils, more than stone tools, they remain in the shape of how we learn, through watching, through repetition, through rhythm and gesture. They remain in our need to gather, to sit by firelight, to feel safe in groups. They remain in the way our minds remember smell, sound, emotion, and pattern, long before we remember words. And perhaps most of all, they remain in our moments of awe, those pauses when we are struck silent by beauty, by mystery, by the vastness of life. That silence is theirs. That wonder is the echo of their first look at the stars. To walk before language is not to walk without meaning. It is to walk with full presence, with deep listening, with understanding that does not rely on speech. In a world where noise often overwhelms, their memory invites us to return, to the simplicity of being, to the clarity of sensing, to the unspoken truths that live between the lines. Theirs was a language of wind and warmth, of gaze and gravity, a language not of grammar, but of grace. And perhaps, as we quiet ourselves now, we can hear them again, not as ghosts, but as guides, not as relics, but as relatives. They teach us that words are not the only path to connection. That knowledge lives in action, in rhythm, in silence. That life itself is the first story, and it was told with footsteps, with hands, with breath. Even now, in the flicker of instinct, in the hush before sleep, in the stillness between thoughts, they are with us, and so we thank them, not with monuments, but with memory, with the soft promise to pause, to listen, to feel the world again as they did, raw, beautiful, sacred, and whole. In the end, their silence was never empty. It was full of meaning waiting to be heard. And now, with language in our mouths and their memory in our hearts, we finally begin to understand what they knew all along, that to be alive is not just to speak, but to feel, to witness, to belong. The ones who walked before language never needed words to leave their mark. They left it in us. Beneath the canopy of forgotten time lies a forest of stone, a quiet archive etched not in ink, but in shape, pressure, and persistence. This forest does not grow with leaves, yet it blooms with memory. Its trees are not wood, but tools, stood across ancient ground, each one carved by a hand that lived long before history began. We call this place the archaeological record, but it is more than that. It is a whispering landscape where the echoes of vanished lives still drift between the fragments of obsidian and flint. These are the echoes in the stone forest, and they tell a story without voice, a story shaped in the moment when thought met matter, and intention became artifact. They speak of beings who held the earth in their hands and changed it, not to dominate but to survive, to express, to remember. Imagine, now, the first hand that chipped a stone not by accident, but with purpose. That moment, perhaps 1,000,000 years ago, was a hinge in the unfolding of human consciousness, a sharp edge broken from a larger whole, held up to the light and tested on hide or bone. The spark of understanding that followed, that one shape could do more than another, was a silent revolution. From that point, stones became more than stones. They became partners in survival, extensions of will, the first external memory. Each tool made was an idea made visible. And so the forest of stone began to grow, quietly, patiently, scattered across plains and caves, deserts and riverbanks, layer upon layer of ancient touch. The earliest tools made by Homo habilis were simple: core and flake, hammer and anvil, the bones of a technology not yet adorned with elegance but alive with intent. These tools were not random, they were chosen, shaped and used with increasing sophistication. In their wear patterns, we can see where hands once pressed, how movements repeated, how minds understood. They butchered animals, scraped hides, cracked nuts, carved wood. In their silence, the tools spoke of adaptability, of learning, of generations watching and imitating. No one taught with words, yet the knowledge endured. Every successful tool was a memory passed not through sound but through structure. To hold a tool shaped by another was to hold their thoughts in your hand. And then, as time walked forward, the tools changed. Acheulean hand axes appeared, symmetrical, teardrop-shaped, complex. They required not just skill but vision, the ability to anticipate a final shape, to imagine it inside the stone before striking. This was not instinct. It was abstract thought. It was planning, foresight, creativity. These axes were found across vast regions, from Africa to Asia to Europe, made in nearly identical forms by individuals who never met. How then did the idea spread? It suggests a shared understanding, a cultural thread woven through gesture and repetition, carried not by language but by the continuity of doing. The stone remembered, even if the hands that shaped it did not speak. In the caves of Europe and across the highlands of Asia, flake tools evolved into blades, scrapers, awls, each with a specific task, each refined with care. The Neanderthals, long thought to be simple, now reveal themselves as skilled artisans. Their tools were precise, often customized for local materials or seasonal needs. They used birch tar as adhesive, hafted tools with wooden handles, and managed their toolkits like travelling craftsmen. They recycled old tools, reshaped broken ones, adapted designs. There is intelligence here, quiet and unassuming but undeniable. They lived in a world that demanded attention, and their tools reflect minds deeply attuned to use, form and function. And yet, not all tools were purely practical. Some objects, like carefully pierced shells, polished stones and shaped bones, hint at meaning beyond survival. These are not only tools, they are symbols. A shell worn as an ornament, a rock etched with parallel lines, a figurine carved from ivory. Each one holds a question. Why? What thought gave rise to decoration? What feeling stirred the desire to mark, to shape beauty? These may have been the first steps toward art, toward ritual, toward memory externalized not just in utility but in emotion. The stone forest, once filled only with tools of necessity, now had sprouts of expression, and in those delicate sprigs of meaning, the human spirit stretched further than ever before. Let us now walk through this forest as if it were a museum, not of walls, but of landscapes. Imagine a plain in East Africa, scattered with flakes from an afternoon of tool-making. The wind lifts dust across the rocks, and the shape of a flint core still echoes the hand that struck it. Or a cave in France, dim and silent, where the floor bears thousands of discarded blades, worn down through years of shaping and use. In the layers above, newer tools lie, different forms, different styles, marking the passage of time like rings in a tree. Each layer is a voice, not speaking in sound but in form, saying, "We were here, we thought, we learned." The stone forest also teaches us about community. To make tools required more than hands. It required eyes that watched, minds that remembered, time that was shared. In this way, the act of crafting became social. Around the fire, one might chip flint while another scraped hide. Children watched, imitated, practiced. Mistakes were made, corrected not with scolding but with example. Over time, certain individuals became experts, the keepers of craft, the shapers of stone. Their knowledge lived not in books but in rhythm and touch. The culture of tool-making became the first classroom, the first tradition. And though we find no words in the forest of stone, we find continuity, lines of inheritance that flowed without interruption, like wind across generations. This forest is still growing, not with new tools but with new discoveries. Every year, archaeologists unearth more. Tiny blades, hidden caches, mysterious objects that challenge our assumptions. Some tools appear thousands of miles from the materials they were made from, suggesting trade or migration. Others show microscopic traces of plant fibers, revealing the earliest textiles. Still others bear marks of repeated use, repaired again and again, telling stories of endurance, of attachment. Each discovery is a leaf added to the forest, a new echo rising from the ground. And perhaps the most haunting echoes come from the tools we cannot explain. A polished sphere of stone with no clear function. A carved bone whose marks seem decorative, or mnemonic, or perhaps nothing at all. These are the whispers we strain to hear, the footsteps we try to follow in a world too old to fully remember. But still, we listen. Still, we gather the stones, brush them clean, hold them up to the light and wonder, what did you mean? Who made you? What were they feeling that day, that moment when they shaped you from the earth? The forest of stone is not silent. It speaks in lines, in curves, in pressure and wear. It tells us not only what was done, but how it was felt. In every chip and groove there is intention. In every smoothed surface there is care. These are not random relics. They are the earliest sentences ever written, not in language but in labour. They are the first declarations of human thought made durable. And in holding them, we do not just remember, we return, we place our hands where theirs once lay. We feel their thoughts in the stone. We become for a moment part of their forest, listening, learning, walking among echoes. Let us walk further now into this stone forest, not as strangers but as quiet observers, where every flake and shard is a syllable in the long unspoken sentence of early human life. These ancient tools were more than survival instruments. They were companions shaped with patience and thought, used until their edges dulled, then reworked with care. In their simple forms we find the origin of complexity. Each tool is a memory that refused to vanish, a breath held inside stone. And when we gather them from the earth, when we study their wear and form, we are not only recovering artifacts, we are resurrecting gestures, reviving decisions made by minds that once pulsed with the same electricity that flows through ours. These tools were once warm in someone's hand, clenched by fingers calloused from work, carried in satchels woven from grass or skin. They are not dead things. They are echoes of life left behind by those who walked before us. Among the earliest expressions of this stone language were the levallois tools, flakes struck with astonishing precision from prepared cores. This method, used by both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, reveals a deeper layer of thought, planning many steps ahead, envisioning a shape before it existed, then bringing that form to life through sequential action. It is no small thing. It speaks of minds capable of abstraction, of working memory, of intentional design. The person who made a Levallois flake wasn't just reacting, they were imagining. And in that imagination a bridge was forming from mere doing to dreaming. Each stone told a story not just of utility, but of cognitive evolution, of a mind slowly stretching toward the symbolic. The echoes in the stone forest don't stop at the tool itself, they extend into the ways these tools changed behaviour, community and cognition. Consider the moment when someone realised they could haft a flint blade onto a wooden shaft, creating a spear. This was not a single leap, but a layering of knowledge. It required understanding adhesives like resin or tar, binding with sinew or plant fibre, shaping the shaft to balance the weight. These were complex processes requiring cooperation, experimentation, and perhaps shared ritual. Once such tools were made, they changed the body's reach, extended its power. The human hand, now holding a spear, became part of a larger system. Body, brain, and object forming a triad of control. This is the beginning of technology as extension. The forest of stone grew taller, and thought branched with it. At the edge of this forest we find the beginnings of symbolism. A line carved into ochre, a circle etched into a stone, a bead pierced to hang on a thread. These are not necessities. They are expressions. They carry no function but meaning, no purpose but feeling. Some of the oldest known engravings, found in places like Blombos Cave in South Africa, date back more than 70,000 years. Simple geometric patterns, carefully made. What did they mean? Perhaps they marked identity, clan, memory, or belief. Or perhaps they were the first attempt to externalize thought, to share what lay within without using voice. These are the earliest scripts, long before alphabets, long before ink. They are quiet songs sung through stone. And what of the hands that made them? The fingers that pressed ochre to wall, that twisted fibres into cord that shaped the edge of a blade until it glinted just right. They belonged to people who lived with danger and beauty equally. Their days were shaped by weather, by animals, by hunger, but also by wonder. They noticed patterns. They remembered places. They formed bonds not only with one another, but with place. Tools found at seasonal campsites suggest return, familiarity, belonging. The forest of stone was also a map, a guide to home, to memory, to life unfolding over and over across familiar terrain. These early people did not live alone. Children were born or was taught through watching. Elders passed down knowledge not through lessons but through presence. A child might sit beside a toolmaker and mimic the motions, learning not only how to strike but when. This was a school without words, but rich with meaning, and in these exchanges, relationships deepened. Toolmaking was more than function, it was culture. Shared methods, preferred shapes, chosen materials, all of these became signatures, not of individuals but of communities. Archaeologists now identify cultural groups by the style of tools they left behind. Mousterian, Aurignacian, Gravettian. These names are modern, but they reflect something ancient, identity, carried through stone. And as time moved forward, the tools became more refined, more varied, more specific. Awls for piercing hides, burins for carving bone, microliths for composite tools. The forest became a city filled with innovation, and alongside this, art bloomed. Cave paintings emerged, hand stenciled in red, animals in motion, dots and spirals and visions. Some of these artworks date back more than 40,000 years, their pigments still vivid, their meaning still mysterious. Were they magic? Memory? Messages? We cannot say, but we know they mattered. The effort taken to make them deep inside caves, with fire for light and stone for brush, tells us they meant something. And meaning, once born, never fully disappears, it echoes. The tools and symbols together tell us that these early people thought not just about today, but about time itself. They planned for the future. They remembered the past. They marked places, perhaps even events. They began to understand themselves as part of something larger, something that moved beyond the moment. They were shaping not only tools, but stories. And those stories, silent as they were, began to shape the mind. The brain, responding to this complexity, grew more connected. Regions responsible for vision, motor control, memory and planning became more integrated. The act of tool-making itself may have rewired the brain. Each strike of stone a neuron fired, each gesture a network built. Over generations, this became not only adaptation but transformation. We were becoming not just smarter, but more imaginative, more aware. And as language dawned, it did not replace the stone forest. It grew from it. Language is an extension of the same impulse that shaped the first blade, a desire to control, to share, to preserve. And so, the forest of stone is not a relic. It is a foundation. It is still with us, in the way we hold a pen, strike a key, shape an idea. The tools may have changed, but the hands have not. We still crave precision. We still tell stories through objects. We still feel connected to the things we make. A smartphone, a sculpture, a painted wall, all of these are descendants of that first stone struck with thought. And in the quiet places, where ancient tools still lie buried, the echoes remain. Not loud, not urgent, but the steady. They say, "We were here, we thought, we made, we mattered." And if we listen, really listen, we may find that they are not only telling us who they were, but reminding us who we are. Now let us drift gently toward the final turn in this stone-laced journey, where time folds softly over itself, and memory becomes something more than survival. It becomes meaning. The stone forest does not end with the last flake of obsidian or the final point of a spearhead. Instead, it stretches forward invisibly into every tool we now touch, into the way we think and move and remember. The echoes that began with a hand-chipping rock against rock still hum within our modern minds. The tools have changed, but the need to shape the world remains. That need was born in instance, nurtured by observation, and passed like breath between generations who never knew language, yet knew everything essential about how to live. When we pick up a tool today, be it a phone, a pencil, or a chisel, we are following their path, continuing their story. In their world, beauty was utility. A well-made scraper was not admired because it was pretty, but because it worked, because it made life just a little easier. But even in their efficiency, these tools often show signs of care beyond the practical. Some were shaped more elegantly than needed, their symmetry pleasing to eyes that had no word for symmetry. Others were made from materials carried long distances, chosen not because they were the closest, but because they were the best, or perhaps the most beautiful. What does that tell us? That even before we carved symbols or painted walls, we were moved by a sense of form, a longing for quality, maybe even a flicker of pride. It was the beginning of aesthetics, of valuing the how, not just the what. Across the vast stretch of early human history, tools became passports between environments. Stone didn't just shape meat and hide, it shaped possibility. With better tools, we hunted larger prey, tanned more durable clothing, cut timber for shelter, and prepared more nourishing food. In this way, stone tools extended our survival radius. They allowed small groups to move, to adapt, to make homes in unfamiliar places. Tools turned landscape into opportunity. They helped humans cross rivers, climb mountains, and eventually span continents. But they also carried stories. A type of flint found hundreds of miles from its origin tells us someone walked that far, or someone else passed it along. With each shard we trace not just lives but connections. The stone forest was not isolated. It was woven with paths of trade, of migration, of relationship. And beneath these relationships lived memory. You see, every tool was also a teacher. A child watching a toolmaker wasn't just learning technique, they were absorbing identity, custom, values. Perhaps a certain way to shape a point was tied to a group's sense of place, or to a lineage of ancestors. To make a tool in the old way was to connect with the old ones. It was a silent form of loyalty. Even without language, early humans passed on ways of being. Each time they struck stone, they struck not only for function, but for belonging. And then came the burial sites, places where tools were not just used, but placed carefully beside the dead. This is where the forest of stone meets the first garden of grief. A blade tucked under a hand, a tool placed near the ribs, ochre scattered like petals. These were not acts of chance, they were gestures of farewell, and with them we glimpse the beginning of ceremony. We see the idea that tools carried not just use but presence, that they could accompany someone into the unknown. Here the line between object and symbol fully blurs. A tool becomes a part of the self. It is not just something you use, it is something that represents you even after breath has left your lungs. Over time the forest grew even more intricate. Bone tools, antler harpoons, needles of ivory. These were not only sharper, they were more expressive. A bone carved with lines, a bead etched with circles, a pendant smoothed by fingers over years. We see not only utility, but intention, preference, even art. The human hand was no longer just surviving, it was shaping beauty, marking memory, and experimenting with form. These artifacts tell us that by the time of the Upper Paleolithic, humans were no longer merely adapting to the world, they were remaking it. In the echoes of the stone forest, we hear the first heartbeat of design. Still, for all their evolution, these tools never lost their connection to nature. Stone, bone, fire, water, these remain the core materials. Early humans were not separate from the land. They moved with its rhythms, read its signs, and used what it offered with reverence. A flint core was not plundered, it was chosen. A bone was not discarded, it was reshaped. The forest of stone was a partnership, not a conquest. And in this balance we find a lesson we still need. That technology, at its best, does not sever us from nature. It binds us to it more deeply. Now, in our age of screens and satellites, we might think ourselves far from that ancient forest. But are we? Look around. Every crafted thing, from the chair beneath you to the phone in your hand, owes its existence to the first time a stone was shaped with purpose. That impulse, to take raw material and give it form, is the same. It has simply grown more complex. The gestures are more precise, the tools more powerful, but the origin remains unchanged. We are still the children of the stone forest, still shaping, still seeking, still listening to the silence between action and meaning. And when we pause to reflect, we may find ourselves drawn to the same instincts that guided them. We still gather around fire, even if it's electric light. We still pass on skills by showing, not telling. We still hold on to objects, not because we need them, but because they remind us of who we are. A photograph, a carved trinket, a smooth stone kept in a pocket, all of these are modern echoes of ancient gestures. We are not so different from them, and perhaps that is the most comforting echo of all. So let the forest remain, not in shadow but in memory. Let each tool unearthed be seen not only as a remnant, but as a voice, a soft, enduring voice that says, I was here, I mattered, I made something. Let us listen, and in listening let us remember not just the tools but the hands that made them, the lives they served, and the quiet brilliance they carried. The stone forest was never silent. It was always singing. We simply had to become still enough to hear it. There was a time when the world was cold, not just in wind but in understanding, when darkness fell not only on the land but inside the mind. A time before the flame, before that flicker of orange breath warmed the night, before its dance on cave walls revealed the shape of the imagination. And then it came. Fire. A wild thing at first, born from lightning erupting from dry leaves and thunderous skies. It frightened, it destroyed, it ran untamed across grasslands and forests. But one day someone did not run. Someone stayed. Someone watched the fire not with fear but with wonder, and in that gaze something shifted. The fire that once was only danger became potential. From that moment the fire did more than warm hands. It lit minds. This is the story of the fire that lit the first minds, a quiet revolution not of tools or bones, but of thought, of community, of the first inner light flickering into being. To hold fire is to hold a contradiction. It burns, yet comforts. It destroys, yet preserves. Early humans who first tamed this wild energy were doing more than capturing heat. They were shaping a new way of being. Before fire, the night was a boundary. Predators owned the dark and the cold bit deep into the bones. But fire extended the day. It pushed back the unknown. Around it people gathered, not just to survive but to connect. And in that circle of warmth thought began to stretch. Firelight revealed faces, movement, expression. It slowed life down. It made space for pause. In those pauses, reflection bloomed. Imagine the first hearth, stones arranged carefully, embers carried from one shelter to the next, guarded with reverence. Fire was not easily made then. It was caught from nature, nurtured like a child, and never left alone. Whole groups would organize their days around its tending. The one who kept the flame became sacred, perhaps honored, perhaps feared. And around that flame stories may have begun, not yet spoken, but gestured, acted, remembered in the flicker of light and the shift of shadow. Fire created time not only for rest, but for dreaming. It invited people to sit, to be still, to imagine. In the hush of a fire-lit night, the first seeds of narrative may have been sown. But fire did more than shape thought. It reshaped biology. Cooked food is easier to chew, easier to digest. This freed energy once used by the gut to be redirected to the brain. Over generations, this meant bigger brains, faster connections, more capacity for memory, for emotion, for foresight. Fire literally fed the mind. It softened roots and meat, made bones crackable for marrow, and reduced the risk of illness. It allowed for new diets, new territories, new survival. But even more profoundly, it gave rhythm to life. Fire created the first clock, its dying embers marking the passage of night, its reignition signalling the start of day. Life now moved in cycles lit by flame. With fire, space changed. The cave was no longer just shelter. It became home. Walls once invisible were now canvases for thought. On them handprints appeared. Animals sprang to life in ochre and ash. Swirls, dots, figures, some drawn again and again as if to hold on to something fading. These were not mere decorations. They were acts of remembering, of longing, of trying to fix the fleeting. Firelight flickering across these early images made them move, made them live. In this dance of flame and pigment, imagination took its first breath. The mind, once trapped in the immediate, began to stretch toward the symbolic. And with this came language, or at least the shape of it. Around fire, voices softened. Harsh cries became murmurs. Sound became rhythm. The first syllables may have been born in firelight, soothing a child, mimicking the sound of cracking wood, calling softly in the dark. Fire demanded proximity, and proximity demanded communication. In that warmth, words began to form, not all at once, not clearly, but insistently. The mind, already expanded by fire-fed thought, now had something to say. What better time to speak than when the hunt was done, when the shadows stretched long and the stars began to hum? Fire also brought memory, not just the memory of place, but of event, of meaning. A fire circle marked where something happened, a birth, a death, a feast, a decision. Return to that spot, and the ashes told a story. The fire became a marker of experience, and so people began to gather not just because they had to, but because they wanted to. Around fire they remembered, and in remembering they became something new, a species that did not live only in the now, but carried the weight of before and the wonder of what could come next. Even danger changed. Fire kept predators away. It gave humans a new power to defend, to deter, to dominate. But most importantly, it gave time to think, time to plan, time to act. In the stillness of night, daring into flame, the first questions may have come. Why does the sun rise? Where do the dead go? What lives in the dark? These were not yet spoken, but they stirred, deep in the glowing mind. Fire made room for questions, and questions made room for the future. Consider now the bond between fire and community. To keep fire is to share responsibility. It cannot be left alone. One must gather wood, another must tend the coals, someone must feed it, someone must guard it. This shared task created structure, a rhythm of cooperation. Fire needed them as much as they needed it, and in the mutual dependence society formed, not in rigid laws but in shared roles, shared warmth, shared vision. The fire was not just in the centre of the camp, it was at the centre of the mind. And perhaps this is where emotion deepened. The quiet moments by the fire became places for comfort, for bonding. A parent rocking a child near the flame, a friend handing food to another, a group huddled close in storm or snow. Firelight illuminated faces, made eyes shine, cast expressions into relief. In those faces, empathy grew. The awareness of the other became not just recognition but connection. And through that connection, care emerged. Not instinctual but chosen. Fire did not just light the dark, it warmed the heart. So let us pause here in the glow of that first flame and honour what it gave us. Not just heat, not just light, but the beginning of selfhood. With fire the mind opened. It dreamed, it remembered, it spoke, it mourned, and most of all, it reached for more. Fire was the first mirror, the first cradle of thought, the first companion that was not flesh or blood, but energy made visible. It changed us, not by force, but by invitation, and still, today, we gather around fire, campfires, candles, hearths, screens. We watch the flicker, and we feel something old stir within us, the same wonder, the same hush, the same sense that something larger is here, just beyond the flame. We are not far from those first minds. Their fire still burns. Let us wander now deeper into the glow, tracing how fire not only illuminated the night but began to sculpt the architecture of thought itself. With each passing generation, fire became more than a flicker of a warmth. It became a vessel for memory, a rhythm keeper for life, a threshold between the known and the unknown. The early humans who sat around it did not yet write or speak as we do, but they began to think differently, to remember in layers, to imagine beyond what was seen. Fire, that once dangerous flicker, had become a friend, a teacher, and perhaps even something sacred. It brought predictability to an otherwise unpredictable world. In its crackle they found repetition. In its glow they found form. In its shadows they began to dream. And fire was patient. It gave humans a kind of pause the world had never offered before. Before fire, there was no evening as we know it. Nightfall meant sleep or fear, but fire allowed for a third option: reflection. Around fire the day extended. The mind, no longer occupied with constant movement or survival, turned inward. In that interior space something began to form, not just memories of what happened, but thoughts of what might be. Possibility, the tender root of creativity, sprouted here. Fire was not the creator of imagination, but its guardian, offering space and time for it to unfold. In its glow, the first hypothetical thoughts may have emerged. What if I go a different path tomorrow? What if the animal returns? What if the sky never brightens again? Within these flickering circles of warmth, relationships grew more nuanced. Fire drew people close physically and emotionally. Proximity led to cooperation, to shared tasks, to shared silence. In that closeness, bonds deepened. Empathy, already flickering in our ancestors, was fanned by fire into a steady flame. When one wept, others saw. When one laughed, others felt it too. Emotions became visible in the firelight. Faces told stories before words did. Tears gleamed. Eyes widened. Mouths curled. In that shared light, emotions became communal, no longer locked in the body, but reflected and received. And so the emotional mind was born, not just as a private experience, but as a shared landscape. Fire also brought vulnerability. It needed fuel, tending, protection. It could be extinguished by wind, swallowed by rain, forgotten in haste. It asked something of its keepers: attention, devotion, care. In caring for fire, early humans began to understand the responsibility of nurturing something beyond themselves. This care transferred. If one could tend a flame, one could tend a child, a sick friend, an injured elder. Fire taught patience. It required return. You could not light it and walk away. You had to remain, to wait, to tend. And in that tending, time softened. The mind, learning to wait, also learned to remember longer, to feel deeper, to plan further ahead. Fire created continuity, not just of flame, but of thought. As the knowledge of fire spread, it became one of the earliest forms of culture. Not every group learned to create fire, but many learned to carry it. Embers wrapped in bark or moss, kept glowing through journeys, became the seeds of new hearths. The fire a family gathered around may have been born from another fire weeks or even years before. This continuity was not just practical, it was symbolic. It meant that fire was not only a tool, but a lineage. A flame passed down became a thread of identity, a sign of belonging, of origin. Even when words were few or absent, the fire spoke clearly. This is us. This is our place. This is our warmth. In different regions, fire found different expressions. In some, it was built into pits surrounded by stone guarded from wind and rain. In others, it was raised in mounds, its smoke rising as a signal or offering. Its light was reflected on tools, on walls, on eyes, and slowly, perhaps without knowing, humans began to associate fire not only with life, but with meaning. The fire burned when a child was born. It burned when someone died. It burned when food was shared, when stories were told, when decisions were made. It became part of ritual long before ritual had a name, and in this way, fire became spiritual, not in dogma, but in presence. It was always there, always central, always listening. The connection between fire and memory deepened with time. Ashes left behind became markers of past events. Fire-blackened stones told of places returned to years after years. Charred bones cracked by heat revealed feasts and gatherings. Fire became part of the archaeological record, but more importantly, it became part of collective memory. Where there was fire, there had been life, and so humans began to mark their stories not just with what they said or did, but with where they burned. The landscape became a living archive, a constellation of fire circles tying past to present. One could walk through valleys and know, here someone once sat, here someone once sang, here someone once waited through the long night. Even danger was reimagined through fire. Once feared for its uncontrollable power, fire was now a protector. It kept predators at bay. It allowed for safer sleep. It gave humans the upper hand in a world that had once overwhelmed them. But this power came with humility. Fire could still consume. A spark in dry grass could erase a forest. A forgotten ember could destroy a shelter. And so, with fire came the first understanding of balance, of how something so powerful must be treated with respect. Perhaps the earliest moral lessons were not spoken by elders, but whispered by flame, to tend, to share, to respect. These were the values born in the flicker. Around fire, the first glimpses of ritual may have emerged. Movements repeated, objects arranged, faces painted in its glow, bones stacked, not just discarded, patterns etched in the dirt, in the ash. All these gestures suggest something deeper than survival. They suggest meaning. Fire created a space not only for thought, but for reverence. The unknown, the sacred, the felt but not seen, all found a home in its light. The fire became a place of transformation, not just of raw meat into nourishment, but of silence into song, of fear into community, of darkness into understanding. And with this came reverence. The sky was not only studied, it was worshipped. It became sacred. Altars were aligned with constellations. Prayers were offered to the sun. Burial sites pointed toward the stars, not because they knew what stars were, but because they felt their importance. They saw the dead leave and the stars remain. And perhaps they hoped the two were connected, that in death, one returned to the sky, became a light, a watcher. In this way, the sky gave comfort. It said, "You are part of something larger. You're not forgotten." So when we gaze up now from cities lit with artificial suns, we are not doing something new. We are repeating an ancient gesture. We are looking for patterns, for meaning, for memory. We are listening as they did to the whispers from the forgotten sky. And if we are quiet enough, we may still hear what they heard, not in words, but in rhythms, in presence. in light. Now we arrive at the gentle close of this long and starlit journey, where memory meets meaning, and the sky, once feared and worshipped, becomes something softer, something internal. For those early people who lived under the open heavens, the sky was not a puzzle to solve, but a presence to live beside. Its cycles shaped their own, its silence mirrored their thoughts, and its constancy grounded their wandering lives. And as they passed through seasons and generations, their minds quietly changed. Not all at once, not in leaps, but in rhythms, slow, steady, like the movement of stars across time. The sky taught them how to wait, how to wonder, how to find shape in stillness. And in that shape they began to place themselves, not as the centre, but as part of a pattern, a breath inside a breath, a flicker inside the vast flame of night. By the time humans had spread across continents, the whispers of the sky had been folded into every culture, every story, every quiet ritual of survival and reverence. In the Arctic, they saw the auroras as dancing spirits. In the deserts, they read the stars like trails. In the islands, they followed the constellations across the sea. Each people listened in their own way, but what bound them was the shared understanding that above them was something both steady and mysterious, something too vast to hold and yet close enough to feel. The sky was never truly forgotten. Even when words changed and empires rose and fell, it stayed, unbothered, unrushed, waiting. And even as science emerged, as telescopes turned stars into numbers and theories mapped the universe in light years and gravity, the soul of skywatching was never fully lost. Because it was never only about measurement, it was about relationship. When a person looked at the stars, they did not only seek answers, they sought reflection, they sought memory, they sought connection, and this yearning, this quiet reaching upward, has remained with us, in planetariums and mountaintops, in backyards and quiet country roads, in children lying in grass, eyes wide, whispering wishes to lights that don't blink. The human heart still turns to the sky when it wants to remember where it came from, because deep down we know we were shaped not just by earth but by sky. Our circadian rhythms still respond to light and dark. Our moods still lift with sun and shift with season. We sleep best under a dark canopy. We wake when light spills across the window. The patterns that guided our ancestors are etched into our biology. We are creatures of cycles, of return, of rhythm, and these rhythms were first learned by watching the heavens, when to plant, when to hunt, when to gather, when to rest. Even now we speak of seasons not only in terms of weather, but in terms of life, a season of growth, a season of grief, a season of change. The sky gave us this metaphor. It gave us the shape for things too large to name. The whispers from the forgotten sky taught us to see beauty in recurrence. That a thing can disappear and yet return, that darkness does not mean ending. That sadness holds the promise of sound. The moon wanes, but it also waxes. The sun sets, but it also rises. The stars vanish in the light, but they are always there. This gave early humans the first sense of faith, not in religion necessarily, but in continuity. The sky said, all things move, but not all things end. Even the stars that die leave traces. Even the light that fades travels forever. And in this quiet revelation, hope was born. Not loud or boastful, but gentle. Hope that spring would come again, hope that the rains would return, hope that what was lost might be found once more. This kind of hope is not loud. It is not about certainty. It is about waiting, watching, trusting in the rhythm. And perhaps that's why even now we find ourselves returning to the sky in moments of deep emotion. We look up when we feel small. We look up when we feel joy. We look up when we say goodbye. Because the sky, more than anything, holds space. It never demands. It only offers presence, pattern, possibility. As writing emerged and calendars were carved into stone and memory became manuscript, the sky continued its silent work. It did not need to be remembered to continue, but we remembered it anyway in myths, in maps, in monuments aligned with the solstice sun. We built our homes and temples to face the sunrise. We honoured eclipses with song. We buried our dead beneath the constellations. We stitched the stars into our stories because they were always there, always watching, and in doing so we gave our lives shape, something to hold on to, something to walk beside. And still, in the most private moments when no instruments are measuring, no rituals are observed, the sky speaks, not in symbols or signs, but in quietness, in the way the wind softens just before the moon rises, in the hush that follows the first star, in the pull we feel when the sky is clear and we, for reasons we can't explain, simply have to look. That pull is old, older than speech, older than fire. It is the body remembering something the mind has forgotten, a language made not of sound but of silence. So now, as we close this final chapter, let us remember not just the facts of the sky, not just its seasons and stars, but the feeling of it, the way it holds us without holding, the way it waits, the way it watches back. The whispers from the forgotten sky are not truly forgotten. They live in us still, in the architecture of our sleep, in the turning of our thoughts, in the patterns we carry without knowing. We are skyborn, not in the literal sense, but in rhythm, in memory, in meaning. And perhaps that is what it means to be human, to listen, to watch, and to remember what cannot be said, only felt. The sky spoke first. We simply answered.